September 21st, 1953. The morning sun rose over Sunan Air Base just outside Pyongyang, North Korea, illuminating rows of Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters lined up on the tarmac. 2 months had passed since the Korean Armistice Agreement ended 3 years of brutal warfare that had devastated the Korean peninsula and killed millions. The ceasefire had brought an uneasy quiet to the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea, but the ideological divide remained as sharp as ever. Among the North Korean pilots preparing for routine training flights that morning was Senior Lieutenant No Kum Sok, a 21-year-old ace pilot who had survived a year of intense aerial combat against American forces. What his commanding officers, his fellow pilots, and the guard watching the airfield didn't know was that No had been planning this moment for months, perhaps years. He had no intention of returning from this training mission. In 17 minutes, he would accomplish one of the most audacious defections of the Cold War era, delivering to the United States the one prize they had desperately sought throughout the entire Korean War, a fully intact, operational MiG-15 fighter jet. No Kum Sok was born in 1932 in what would later become North Korea, into a world already shaped by colonial occupation and geopolitical struggle. Korea had been under brutal Japanese colonial rule since 1910, and No grew up in a society where Korean identity was systematically suppressed and the population subjected to forced labor, cultural erasure, and military conscription. His father was a prosperous businessman, relatively well-educated and forward-thinking by the standards of the time. This background gave young No certain advantages: access to education, exposure to ideas beyond the narrow confines of colonial propaganda, and a family culture that valued learning and critical thinking. These early experiences would prove crucial in shaping the independent mindset that would eventually lead him to risk everything for freedom. The end of World War II in August 1945 brought liberation from Japanese rule, but it also brought division. The Soviet Union and the United States, unable to agree on Korea's future, hastily divided the peninsula along the 38th parallel. The Soviets established a communist regime in the north under Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese insurgent leader who had spent years in Soviet-controlled Manchuria. The Americans set up an anti-communist government in the south under Syngman Rhee. What was meant to be a temporary administrative division hardened into 2 separate states, each claiming to be the legitimate government of all Korea. For ordinary Koreans like No Kum Sok, the division meant families separated, economic systems imposed from outside, and the constant threat of renewed warfare. No witnessed firsthand the construction of the North Korean totalitarian state. Kim Il-sung's regime, backed by Soviet advisors and military power, systematically eliminated opposition, collectivized agriculture, nationalized industry, and established an all-encompassing surveillance system. The cult of personality around Kim Il-sung grew increasingly extreme, with his portrait mandatory in every home, his ideology taught as sacred truth, and any hint of dissent punished with imprisonment or execution. For No's family, prosperous and educated, the new order was particularly threatening. Wealth and education marked them as potential class enemies, bourgeois elements to be suppressed or eliminated. No learned early to hide his thoughts, to repeat the required slogans, to show outward loyalty while keeping his true beliefs concealed. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950 with North Korea's invasion of the South, No was 18 years old. The war would consume the next 3 years of his life and transform him from a cautious survivor into a combat pilot. The North Korean military, equipped and trained by the Soviet Union, initially swept south with devastating speed, nearly conquering the entire peninsula before American intervention under the United Nations flag pushed them back. The war became a grinding stalemate, with Chinese intervention preventing UN forces from conquering the North, and air power becoming increasingly decisive. It was in this context that No Kum Sok entered military aviation. The path to becoming a MiG-15 pilot was neither easy nor safe. No had to demonstrate not just technical aptitude, but also ideological reliability. The regime was paranoid about defection, particularly among pilots who had the means to escape to the south. Background investigations were thorough and ruthless, with any hint of disloyalty disqualifying candidates. No's relatively privileged background was a liability, marking him for extra scrutiny. But he also had advantages: education, intelligence, physical fitness, and the ability to perform under pressure. He passed the screening and entered flight training. Training in Soviet-designed aircraft was demanding. North Korean pilots learned on older models before graduating to operational jets, studying not just flying technique, but also Marxist-Leninist ideology, military tactics, and the absolute obedience required of pilots in a totalitarian system. No proved to be a natural aviator, mastering the complexities of jet flight and the demanding procedures for combat operations. His performance earned him assignment to a MiG-15 regiment, the elite of North Korean aviation. This posting was both an honor and a test. MiG-15 pilots were watched constantly, their loyalty monitored by political officers and fellow pilots encouraged to inform on each other. The MiG-15 that No would fly into combat was a formidable aircraft. First flown in December 1948, it represented a quantum leap in Soviet aerospace capability. Powered by a reverse-engineered copy of a British jet engine, technology Stalin had obtained through clever exploitation of post-war cooperation. The MiG-15 combined speed, altitude performance, and firepower in a package that shocked Western air forces when it appeared over Korea in November 1950. American pilots flying World War II-era P-51 Mustangs and early jets like the F-80 Shooting Star found themselves completely outclassed. The MiG-15 could climb faster, fly higher, and hit harder than anything the Americans had in theater. The United States responded by rushing F-86 Sabres to Korea, creating the first large-scale jet-versus-jet air combat in history. The battles that followed, fought primarily in the northwestern corner of North Korea in an area American pilots called MiG Alley, became legendary. Soviet pilots, flying in Chinese or North Korean markings to disguise Soviet involvement in the war, engaged American pilots in high-speed combat at altitudes above 40,000 feet. Radio intercepts revealed Russian voices directing the MiG formations, but both sides maintained the fiction that only Chinese and North Korean pilots were involved. It was a shadow war within the larger conflict, with enormous strategic implications. The MiG-15's primary mission was not dogfighting with American fighters, but attacking B-29 Super Fortress bombers, conducting strategic bombing campaigns against North Korean targets. In this role, the MiG-15 was devastatingly effective. Its powerful cannons and high performance allowed it to slash through bomber formations, overwhelming the defensive firepower of the B-29s. On October 23, 1951, a date American airmen called Black Tuesday, Soviet pilots in MiG-15s attacked a heavily escorted formation of 9 B-29s, shooting down or destroying 8 of them. It was one of the worst single-day losses in American air combat history and demonstrated the MiG-15's lethality. No Kum Sok flew combat missions throughout 1952 and into 1953, engaging American aircraft over the skies of North Korea. He witnessed the brutal reality of aerial warfare: friends killed in combat, near misses with death, the constant stress of missions against a technologically sophisticated enemy. His regiment lost 9 MiG-15s during that year of combat, a casualty rate that reflected the intensity of the air war. Each loss was a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, that even the best pilots could be shot down by a lucky burst of gunfire or mechanical failure. Yet, No survived, accumulated flight hours, and earned the respect of his commanders. But survival in combat did not mean safety on the ground. The North Korean regime was intensely suspicious of its pilots, aware that they possessed the means to defect and deliver valuable aircraft to the enemy. Political officers monitored conversations, watched for signs of ideological wavering, and investigated any pilot whose loyalty seemed questionable. In early May 1953, No's Vice Battalion Commander, Captain Kim Sup, was suddenly summoned to North Korean Air Force headquarters in Sinuiju. The purpose was unknown, but rumors circulated that No himself was under investigation, his loyalty to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea being questioned. For weeks, No waited in fear, uncertain whether he would be arrested, whether his carefully concealed doubts about the regime had somehow been detected. Captain Kim returned, and No was allowed to continue flying, suggesting that his vice commander had defended him or that the investigation had found nothing conclusive. But the incident crystallized No's understanding that he was living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, the regime's paranoia would turn on him again. Perhaps the next investigation would be more thorough, or a jealous rival would fabricate accusations, or some minor slip would reveal his true thoughts about Kim Il-sung's dictatorship. And once suspicion fell on him in earnest, there would be no escape, only imprisonment, torture, and execution. The only way to truly escape the system was to physically leave North Korea. Defection was extraordinarily dangerous. The border with South Korea was heavily fortified, mined, and patrolled by guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross. Civilians caught trying to escape faced execution, and their families were punished as well, guilty by association in the regime's twisted logic. For a pilot, defection meant stealing an aircraft and flying it across the heavily defended, demilitarized zone while avoiding being shot down by North Korean air defenses or American forces who might mistake him for an attacker. The odds of success seemed impossibly low. But the alternative, remaining in North Korea for the rest of his life, was unthinkable. No began planning carefully. He could not share his intentions with anyone, not even family members, because any confidant could become an informer. He studied American air operations, learning when and where F-86 patrols operated, trying to understand how American radar coverage worked. He observed security procedures at his base, noting when guards were most vigilant and when routines made them complacent. Most importantly, he waited for the right moment, a time when suspicion was low, when he would have a plausible reason to be airborne, and when weather and circumstances gave him the best chance of reaching South Korea alive. The Korean Armistice Agreement signed on July 27, 1953, provided that opportunity. With active combat operations ceased, the intense vigilance of wartime began to relax. Training flights resumed as both sides adjusted to the new reality of an armed peace. Soviet pilots, who had flown covertly throughout the war to hide the USSR's direct involvement, were recalled home. The death of Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin in March 1953 had created uncertainty in Moscow, and the new Soviet leadership was eager to reduce commitments in Korea. This meant fewer experienced pilots in the air, less sophisticated command and control, and gaps in the surveillance system. For No, these changes created a window of opportunity. September 21, 1953, began as an ordinary Monday. No suited up for a routine training mission, showing no outward sign of tension or unusual behavior. He climbed into the cockpit of his MiG-15bis, tail number read 2057, and went through the standard pre-flight checks. The aircraft was in good condition, fully fueled, and ready for flight. No knew that fuel would not be an issue. The distance from Soon Air Base to Kimpo Air Base in South Korea was less than 100 miles, easily within the MiG-15's range. The real challenges would be avoiding detection, surviving the crossing, and convincing American forces not to shoot him down. At approximately 9 a.m., No received clearance for takeoff. The MiG-15's engine roared to life, and he accelerated down the runway, lifting off into a clear morning sky. For the first few minutes, he flew normally, following the expected training route. But as soon as he judged himself far enough from the base that pursuit would be difficult, No turned south toward the demilitarized zone. There was no going back now. The moment he deviated from his assigned flight path, he became a defector. If intercepted and forced back, he would face execution. His only option was to reach South Korea. No pushed the MiG-15 to maximum speed, the aircraft accelerating to over 1,000 kilometers per hour as he raced south. The flight from North Korea to South Korea took exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes of sustained terror, knowing that at any moment North Korean radar might detect his deviation, that interceptors might be scrambled, that anti-aircraft guns along the border might open fire. But luck was with him. The North Korean air defense system, still adjusting to post-war operations, failed to react quickly enough. Within minutes, No crossed the 38th parallel and entered South Korean airspace. Now he faced a different danger. American forces who might shoot down an unidentified MiG-15 approaching their positions. No knew he needed to signal his intentions clearly. As he approached Kimpo Air Base, a major American installation outside Seoul, bustling with F-86 Sabres and other aircraft, No wagged his wings, the international signal for a friendly aircraft in distress. He fired colored flares, another distress indication. His hope was that these signals would give American gunners pause, would make them hesitate long enough for him to land before they realized what was happening. Through a combination of luck and American complacency, No's approach went undetected by radar. The radar at Kimpo Air Base had been shut down for routine maintenance that morning. Without radar coverage, ground controllers relied on visual observation, and the base was busy with aircraft landing and taking off in the aftermath of the armistice. No lined up for landing, approaching the runway from the north, the opposite direction from which American aircraft normally landed. This meant he was flying directly toward outgoing traffic. An American pilot, Captain Dave William, was taking off as No came into land. William looked up to see a MiG-15 heading directly toward him on a collision course. He veered out of the way and exclaimed over the radio, "It's a goddamn MiG." Another American pilot, Captain Jim Sutton, circling the airport, watched in disbelief as the Soviet fighter touched down on the runway. Sutton would later say that if No had tried to land in the correct direction, he would have been spotted earlier and likely shot down. The chaotic approach from the wrong direction, combined with the radar being offline, had saved No's life. No landed hard, the MiG-15's tires smoking as they grabbed the pavement. He taxied the aircraft into an empty parking spot between two F-86 Sabres, shut down the engine, and popped the canopy. As American security personnel rushed toward the aircraft, No stood up in the cockpit and performed a symbolic act. He pulled out a photograph of Kim Il-sung that was mandated to be carried in the cockpit of all North Korean aircraft and tore it to pieces. It was a gesture of defiance, a final rejection of the totalitarian system he had escaped. Then he threw up his arms in surrender as armed guards surrounded him. The Americans were stunned. They had been hoping for exactly this scenario throughout the entire war, a communist pilot defecting with an intact MiG-15. In fact, the United States had launched Operation Moolah in April 1953, offering a reward of $100,000, over $1. $1 million in today's currency, to any pilot who could deliver a fully functional MiG-15 to American forces. The operation had involved dropping leaflets over North Korean air bases, broadcasting radio messages, and spreading the offer through intelligence networks. But no pilot had defected before the armistice. The effectiveness of Operation Moolah was uncertain. Had it influenced anyone, or had communist security measures been too effective? No Kum Sok had never heard of Operation Moolah. The leaflets had been dropped primarily on air bases along the Yalu River, but by April 1953, most North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet MiG-15s were stationed in Manchuria, across the border in China. No had never seen the leaflets. He defected not for money, but for freedom, driven by his hatred of Kim Il-sung's dictatorship and his desire to live in a society where he could think and speak freely. The reward was a surprise, albeit a welcome one. The United States, honoring its commitment, paid No the full $100,000. It was life-changing money, enough to build a new life in America. But first came the debriefing. American intelligence officers had thousands of questions about the MiG-15, about North Korean Air Force operations, about Soviet involvement in the war, about training methods, tactics, and the broader military and political situation in North Korea. No answered thoroughly and honestly, providing a wealth of information that complemented the technical examination of his aircraft. He explained North Korean combat doctrine, described the quality of training, revealed the extent of Soviet and Chinese support, and detailed the command structure and political control mechanisms within the North Korean military. For American intelligence analysts, this human intelligence was as valuable as the aircraft itself. The MiG-15bis that No had flown to freedom was immediately the subject of intense examination. American and Allied test pilots, including the legendary Major Chuck Yeager, flew the aircraft extensively at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. They evaluated its performance, tested its limits, and compared it directly to the F-86 Sabre. What they discovered confirmed some assumptions and contradicted others. The MiG-15 had superior climb rate and altitude performance, could sustain higher G-forces in turns, and had heavier armament than the F-86. But American pilots also found weaknesses: control stiffness at high speeds, tendency to snap roll in certain maneuvers, and less sophisticated gunsight systems. The F-86, while inferior in some performance metrics, was more stable and easier to fly accurately, giving skilled pilots an advantage in dogfights. In December 1953, the MiG-15 was disassembled and airlifted to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio for more exhaustive testing and analysis. Engineers examined every component, studying Soviet design philosophy, manufacturing techniques, and material science. The intelligence gained informed American aircraft development for years, helping to design the next generation of fighters that would face Soviet aircraft in future conflicts. The MiG-15 that No had delivered became one of the most studied aircraft in history. No Kum Sok himself faced decisions about his future. He could not return to North Korea. That would mean certain death. South Korea was an option, but it was a war-ravaged country still rebuilding from 3 years of destruction. The United States offered political asylum and the opportunity to build a new life in a free society. No accepted, becoming one of thousands of North Korean defectors who chose the West over communism. He adopted the American name Kenneth H. Rowe, a symbolic rebirth as a new person in a new country. Adjusting to life in America was challenging. No spoke little English initially and had to learn not just a new language, but a completely different culture. He enrolled at the University of Delaware, studying engineering with financial support from the U.S. government. The $100,000 reward gave him financial security and allowed him to focus on education without the immediate pressure of finding employment. He threw himself into his studies, determined to make the most of the freedom he had risked everything to achieve. No excelled academically and eventually earned advanced degrees in engineering. He built a successful career in the aerospace industry, working for major American defense contractors and contributing to the design of advanced aircraft. The skills he had learned as a MiG-15 pilot, technical expertise, attention to detail, ability to perform under pressure, served him well in his new profession. He married, raised a family, and became an American citizen. The boy from North Korea who had flown to freedom in 17 minutes became a respected engineer and a symbol of the Cold War's human dimension. No also became a public speaker and author, sharing his story with American audiences. He wrote a memoir, A MiG-15 to Freedom, detailing his experiences in North Korea, his combat missions, and his dramatic defection. The book provided Western readers with rare insight into life under Kim Il-sung's regime and the psychology of a defector who chose freedom over loyalty to a totalitarian state. No spoke at military installations, universities, and conferences, his story serving as Cold War propaganda, but also as genuine testimony to the power of individual choice in the face of oppression. The defection had consequences that extended far beyond one man's fate. For the United States, obtaining the MiG-15 was an intelligence coup that provided crucial insights into Soviet aerospace technology and validated American assessments of the air war in Korea. For North Korea, the loss of the aircraft was embarrassing, but the defection of a trusted pilot was catastrophic for morale and trust within the military. The regime intensified surveillance of pilots, implemented even stricter security measures, and conducted purges to root out anyone whose loyalty might be questionable. The fear that other pilots might defect created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that further degraded the effectiveness of North Korean air forces. For the broader Cold War narrative, No's defection became a powerful propaganda tool. Here was a young man, trained and trusted by a communist regime, who chose to risk death rather than continue living under totalitarian control. His willingness to abandon family, homeland, and everything familiar for the uncertain promise of freedom in the West confirmed the ideological message that Western democracies were promoting, that communism was oppressive and that free societies were superior. Soviet and North Korean propaganda tried to counter this narrative, claiming that No had been drugged, kidnapped, or brainwashed by American agents. But these claims were transparently false and convinced no one. No Kum Sok lived long enough to see dramatic changes in the world he had fled. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, vindicating his belief that totalitarian communism was unsustainable. North Korea, however, remained frozen in the totalitarian model that No had escaped, ruled by the Kim dynasty in a hereditary dictatorship unique in the communist world. The country became increasingly isolated, impoverished, and militarized, its people subjected to even more extreme propaganda and control than in No's time. The defector who had fled in 1953 watched from America as North Korea became a symbol of failed ideology and human suffering. In his later years, No reflected on his decision and its consequences. He never expressed regret about defecting, though he felt profound sadness about the family he had left behind. Under North Korean law, defectors' families were punished, often sent to labor camps or executed. No did not know what had happened to his parents or siblings, though he feared the worst. The guilt of having potentially caused their suffering weighed on him, a burden that no amount of success or freedom in America could fully lift. Yet he also believed that remaining in North Korea would have meant spiritual death, a slow suffocation of the mind and soul under a system that demanded total subservience. He had chosen life over survival, freedom over security, and he lived with that choice for the rest of his life. No Kum Sok eventually settled in Florida, far from the cold, northern latitudes of his birth. He became Kenneth Rowe, American engineer, husband, father, and living testament to one of the most dramatic defections of the Cold War. The 17 minutes he spent flying from North Korea to South Korea on September 21, 1953, defined his life and shaped history. That brief flight delivered to the United States the intelligence prize they had sought throughout the Korean War, exposed the vulnerabilities of communist air forces, and demonstrated that even in totalitarian systems, individuals could choose freedom. The MiG-15 he flew is now preserved in museums, a relic of Cold War aviation history. But the story of No Kum Sok is about more than airplanes and espionage. It is about a young man who looked at the system that claimed to own him and said no, then prove his defiance by stealing one of his country's most valuable assets and flying into freedom at 1,000 kilometers per hour. In those 17 minutes, he transformed from Senior Lieutenant No Kum Sok of the North Korean People's Air Force into Kenneth Rowe, American citizen and free man. The cost was everything he had known. The reward was a life lived on his own terms.